What's up, AP Psych? Welcome back. So now we are moving on to our next set of disorders, and that includes personality disorders as well as dissociative disorders. So we're going to hop right in and get started. Make sure you're emphasizing all the different signs and symptoms and some of the impacts that these disorders have. And don't forget the 4 Ds of deviant, distressed, dysfunction, and dangerous, which have to be present in order to be diagnosed with a mental disorder. And you'll start to notice how some of these things can be dysfunctional for people and cause distress in daily life, not just for themselves, but for other people as well. So we're going to start with dissociative disorders. Okay? And these dissociative disorders are characterized by a separation of critical parts of your personality. Okay? So for example, like memory, your consciousness, your identity altogether, it's kind of like turned off or changed in a way, right? And that those are normally integrated and work together, they're separated, right? So you may have different consciousness that have different memories or different identities. And people who dissociate key parts of their personality are able to prevent disturbing memories or perceptions from reaching their conscious awareness. So they reduce their anxiety. So we're going to talk about dissociative identity disorder, where people might have multiple personalities, and they can do that to deal with anxiety or stressful certain situations. One alter ego or alter personality may come out to deal with certain situations than the other. Now, these temporary dissociative states are common for most of us, right? So for example, when we separate our memory, our consciousness, think about, after school, let's say you're driving home or you're driving to school, driving many hours on the highway, you're on a road trip or something like that, something you've done many times, driving from school to home. And you realize that you have little or no recollection of what happened during that last 15 to 20 minute drive that you just took, right? You don't remember passing stores, gas stations, exit ramps. You get home and you're like, wait a second, how did I get here? Like you were daydreaming the whole time, or you dissociated yourself from your consciousness in some way, right? That's kind of like a dissociative state. However, like we always talk about, it doesn't rise to the level of being dysfunctional or distressful or deviant, right? It's just a natural part of what some of us go through day to day. But the extreme end of that can lead to these dissociative disorders. So the biggest one that we need to discuss, Dissociative Identity Disorder, which many of you have maybe previously heard of this as multiple personality disorder, right? It's got a new name, but it's a condition in which a person appears to have 2 or more distinct personalities, each which can speak, act, and write in different ways. Okay? So these different identities also seem to have their own memories. That's a part of that dissociation, right? They have different identities, different memories, different consciousnesses. Wishes and impulses, and often the impulses of one identity conflict with those of the other identities, right? Because that is them dealing with those unconscious motives that, like Freud would talk about with psychoanalytic theory. However, problems occur because there is only one body available for all of these different personalities, forcing the personalities to take turns in this dissociation to occur, almost like a switch on and off from one personality to another. And because there can be strong variations in personalities, a person's behavior, if you look at it holistically, overall, can appear very inconsistent. And that would be part of the reason why they could be, potentially diagnosed with this disorder. Now, here's a couple famous examples. Herschel Walker, who's a famous NFL player, Heisman Trophy winning running back at the University of Georgia. He wrote a book after his playing days where he talked about his disorders and his struggles. He had to manage more than what he said was a dozen personalities throughout his life. Another famous case, the case of Chris Sizemore, was made into a movie called The 3 Faces of Eve. 3 of her, what she claimed to have 22 distinct personalities, were depicted in the book and the movie. And they were referred to by doctors as Eve White, Eve Black, and Jane, right? And that was what the movie was about. But Chris Sizemore said she had more than 22 distinct personalities throughout her life. And then the most famous case of all is the case of Shirley Mason, or Sybil. And in the early 1950s, she was a substitute teacher and a student at Columbia University, and she had long suffered from blackouts and emotional breakdowns. Those blackouts, dissociative state, right? Your normal consciousness, Shirley Mason's consciousness would disappear and she would become someone else. And that would be when she blacked out or dissociated. And she would finally enter psychotherapy with a psychologist by the name of Cornelia Wilburn, who was a Freudian psychologist, so practicing psychoanalysis. And their sessions together are the basis of the book Sybil, right? You can read all about it in that book. As she was treated and life went on, she moved to Lexington, Kentucky, where she taught art classes and ran an art gallery out of her home for many years after. But she still experienced those dissociative states and those multiple personalities. And you can see the different art produced by different personalities that she had. And the one on the right was done by her childlike personality. So it's a little more primitive than the one on the left. So some differences there. And this is some of those personalities that Sybil would have described or Shirley Mason would have described. And you can see, interestingly, that some are nameless. One's a baby. Some are men. Some are women. This complete dissociation, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be the same gender or the same age. Things can vary greatly. And when you're in that state, these people don't perceive the fact that, oh, I'm not a male, but they see themselves as one, like Mike Dorset or as Shirley Mason did. So how does this DID develop? Well, if we look at it from a couple different perspectives, you have psychoanalytic, right? And they chalk it up to a massive repression of unwanted impulses or memories that create a new person, right? So classic psychoanalytic approach, repression, unconscious mind, sexual and aggressive urges, all that stuff. This new person acts out otherwise unacceptable impulses or recalls otherwise unbearable memories. So those things that your normal conscious self can't handle, maybe these other personalities pop up to deal with those repressed memories and the results of them. If you're a behaviorist, they explain things. Everyone is capable of acting in different ways in different situations. This disorder is the extreme variation of acting so different that you feel like a different person, right? They're observing your behavior, right? Also, the symptoms are often strengthened by the reward that memory loss or shifting personalities allows an individual to escape stressful situations. So if you can shift in an anxiety-provoking situation, or if you're in a state where one of those repressed and painful memories is coming up, it can be rewarding to switch personalities to deal with that situation and the alleviating the anxiety and distress that comes with it. So actually evaluating the true causes of DID has been difficult because of the rarity of the disorder. It's not common, not very common at all. However, most clinicians do believe that the root cause of the disorder is some sort of abuse or trauma during childhood, right? And as a result, that child separates themselves, dissociates from the abuse as a way to deal with the situation. And they continue to do it throughout the rest of their lives because that's become their coping mechanism and their strategy. So they have more and more of these personalities that develop to deal with trauma as they go throughout life. Now, there are some who do not believe that DID is an actual disorder, and they would accuse some individuals maybe of being a con artist or role-playing to ease their anxieties in their life, and they're not actually different disorders, but they're using it as a way to cope. So there's still some interesting debate with DID because it's one of those mental disorders that is still discussed and debated to this day between psychologists and the different fields of psychology. So that's DID, the dissociative state, the dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. Now let's get into the actual personality disorders. So there's a personality disorder must be defined as a long-standing, inflexible personality trait that impairs social functioning. Okay. Now, that's something to keep in mind. This is a part of their personality. So they often seek treatment at the insistence of others, right? Like a court order or pressure from a family member, because the individual themselves is not distressed by their condition because it's a part of their personality. It's the way that they see the world and interact with the world. So they're not necessarily distressed, but it causes distress to others, which is important to remember. That's how we can categorize the 4 Ds. Distress is distress to yourself or others. Danger is danger to yourself or others. So these would fall into that category. And there's 3 different types or clusters of personality disorders, A, B, and C. We'll go through each one individually. Cluster A exhibits odd or eccentric behavior. B exhibits dramatic or emotional traits. And C is anxious or fearful, right? So we'll touch on the disorders within each of the clusters. So first up, cluster A, odd or eccentric behavior. right? So you have schizoid and schizotypal personality disorder. Within schizoid, right, there's a pattern of indifference to social relationships. And this is where that odd behavior would come into play. You don't really care about interacting with other people or making relationships with them. It's a limited range of emotional expression and experience. The disorder manifests itself by early adulthood through social and emotional detachment that prevent people from having close relationships. So the key here with schizoid is the fact that you don't really care if you have close emotional relationships. You have no desire to make those close relationships, so you're not going to try. Okay. Schizotypal is a pattern of social and interpersonal difficulties that include a sense of discomfort with close relationships. So it's odd behavior again, and eccentric behavior and unusual thoughts and perceptions of reality. Okay, so in this, the big difference between schizoid and schizotypal up here, they don't care about relationships. They're indifferent. Doesn't matter if they have one or not, right? Down here, it's anxiety provoking, causes a lot of discomfort to be around other people. And their perceptions of reality are not accurate about what other people think of them, right? They usually experience distorted thinking, they behave strangely, and avoid intimacy as a result. Okay, so down here, they don't want to be involved because it causes discomfort and anxiety. Up here, they're indifferent to those social situations, both of which lead to odd or eccentric behavior. In addition, in cluster A, there's paranoid personality disorder. And this is individuals with this disorder display pervasive distrust and suspiciousness of society in general, institutions, other people. Right? Some of their common beliefs include the following: that others are exploiting or deceiving them, friends and associates are untrustworthy, information confided to others will be used maliciously, and there's hidden meaning in remarks or events others perceive as benign, okay? Or certain things as like their spouse or partner is unfaithful. So there's this constant distrust to the point where it disrupts their life and distress and dysfunctional, and makes it hard for them to function day to day. Some of these things sound similar to schizophrenia, but we'll see when we get to schizophrenia, there are some classic symptoms and characteristics that differentiate it from these disorders. Okay. So that's cluster A, odd or eccentric behavior, schizoid, schizotypal, and paranoid personality disorders. Within cluster B, there's a few to talk about, and we have two big ones that we'll need to remember. But first up, we have histrionic and narcissistic. So histrionic is a pattern of excessive attention-seeking emotions, usually beginning in early adulthood, including inappropriately seductive behavior and an excessive need for approval. These people are going to be looking to be the center of attention at all times, and they're going to do things to make sure that happens. They're going to try to be overly sexual, and a lot of that includes an excessive need for approval from others. So that's the histrionic pattern of personality disorder. Okay. So cluster B, you exhibit dramatic or emotional traits. Histrionic, very dramatic, right? Think of someone who wants to be the center of attention all the time and will do whatever they need to make that happen. Then you have narcissistic personality disorder, and this is a long-term pattern of abnormal behavior characterized by an exaggerated sense of self-importance, an excessive need for admiration. Right? That's your emotional dramaticness. You are the center of attention. You are the most important thing in the world. The world revolves around you, and you have a lack of empathy for others. So you only really care for yourself. And you don't care what happens to other people because you're narcissistic. You are the center of attention, and the world revolves around you. So one of the most well-known of the cluster B personality disorders is APD, or antisocial personality disorder. Now, when we talk about APD and we talk about antisocial, when we get to social psychology, we'll talk about pro-social things that you can do to benefit society. So I don't want you to think of antisocial personality disorder as you don't like to talk to other people, because that's not the case. Antisocial is that you do things that harm society, or you do things that harm people in society. You're doing negative things to the world. It doesn't mean you dislike to interact with people, because that's not true. So when you say someone's antisocial, it means something totally different than someone who has antisocial personality disorder. Okay? So some of the clinical features of APD must include at least 3 of the following: a lack of conforming to laws, as evidenced by repeatedly committing crimes. That's antisocial, right? You're harming society. They repeated deceitfulness in relationships with others, such as lying, using false names, conning others for profit or pleasure, Oftentimes, these people with APD can be very charming, very charismatic people, and they use that to get what they want and to manipulate. Then you have failure to think or plan ahead, very impulsive, and a tendency to irritability, anger, aggression. And that's shown by repeated assaults of others or getting into frequent physical fights, right? So there's this general disregard for personal safety or the safety of others, right? And that's that dangerous aspect of the 4Ds. So you can see all of this would fall into the category of very antisocial, anti-society, harmful to the community behavior. Now, this disorder cannot be diagnosed until an individual is 18 years old, until they reach adulthood. But to be diagnosed with APD, the individual must have shown symptoms of the diagnosis since 15 years of age. Now, how can that be if you're showing symptoms but can't be diagnosed? Well, usually the individual has been previously diagnosed in childhood with a conduct disorder, a neurodevelopmental disorder that we will get to in a future video. We'll discuss how those symptoms oftentimes and can potentially lead to someone being diagnosed with an antisocial personality disorder later in life. This disorder is shown more often in males than females. And sometimes you may see the terms sociopath or psychopath in relation to APD. So if you see those terms, think APD, antisocial personality disorder. Some of the causes. Some studies have suggested a genetic predisposition, possibly in the form of chronic underarousal of both the autonomic and central nervous systems, which leads to abnormally low anxiousness, which may make people less sensitive to punishment. And other research has linked an underdevelopment of the amygdala to APD, so a lack of fear and the fear response. Others, though, believe that environmental factors like broken homes, rejection by parents, poor discipline, lack of good parenting models, lack of attachment to your caregivers, impulsivity, conflict-filled childhood, and poverty play a role in the behavior exhibited by antisocial individuals. So there's a moment here for us to talk about a big concept that's in your vocab, something called the diathesis stress model. And in this, it's essentially saying that, yes, we can have genetic markers that may lead to some type of disorder, but we also have environmental impact in which these environmental experiences turn that gene on and allow it to express itself so that we experience that disorder, right? And that's the diathesis stress model. What is the genetic marker that tells us that you are predisposed to this biological disorder, and what is the environmental trigger that turned it on and pushed it to play a role in your life? So you might write that down, put a star by that in your vocab, the diathesis stress model. Okay, lastly, understanding antisocial personality disorder. PET scans of 41 murderers revealed reduced activity in the frontal lobe here. In a follow-up study, repeat offenders had 11% less frontal lobe compared to normal. And we know frontal lobe has a lot to do with planning, higher level thinking, organization, critical thought. All of those things are underdeveloped in people with APD and murderers specifically, who oftentimes have antisocial personality disorder. Okay, so our last one for cluster B, and another big one, is borderline personality disorder. So borderline is a pervasive pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships, self-perception, and moods. Impulse control is markedly impaired, and the diagnostic criteria require at least 5 of the following features: frantic efforts to avoid unexpected abandonment, unstable and intense interpersonal relationships, marked and persistent unstable self-image, impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, recurrent suicidal behaviors or threats or self-mutilation, affective instability, chronic feelings of emptiness, inappropriate and intense anger, and transient paranoia or dissociation. Okay. So that wraps up our cluster B disorders to know. Finally, we'll wrap up here with C. Cluster C, these people exhibit anxious or fearful behavior. Okay, so we have 3: avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So let's hit each one real quick. Avoidant, you have a long-standing feeling of inadequacy, and you're extremely sensitive to what others think about you. Okay? You tend to be socially inhibited or inept, and you often seek to avoid work, school, and activities that involve socializing or interacting with others. Okay? And oftentimes you can think, well, maybe this kind of sounds like a social phobia. Remember, a personality is like those permanent traits that define your life. Right? If we go all the way back to slide 1 or 2, the development of personality disorders, they're long-standing, inflexible personality traits that impair our social functioning, right? So it's not a phobia or a fear, it's a part of your personality. Avoid it. Right? Then you have dependent, which is a pervasive and excessive need to be taken care of. It leads to submissive, clinging behavior, right? These two make sense. Avoidant and dependent, their name kind of tells you what's going on. This disordered individual has a self-perception of being unable to function adequately without the help of others. Even making everyday decisions, you're completely dependent and you need someone to help you through it. Then we have obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Okay? This is where you feel anxious if things are disorganized, unplanned, or not exactly right. Exceptionally high standards for yourself and others, and you're very cautious and think about the small details. So these are people who are type A to the max, extremely anal retentive to the point where it is a part of their personality. And this obsessive compulsive personality disorder is different to obsessive compulsive disorder because OCD describes behavior as opposed to a personality, right? So within OCD, it's the compulsions, it's the obsessions and compulsions you're having. It's not a part of your everyday personality. People with OCD realize that what they're doing is irrational, but they can't help themselves. With obsessive compulsive personality disorder, it's a part of who you are, right? Okay. So that was a lot of things in there. I encourage you to go back, review, get into your reading guide, dig into that to help you differentiate not just the clusters, but all of the personality disorders within the clusters. And then, of course, we talked about dissociative disorders with dissociative identity disorder specifically. Okay. So we'll go over some case studies in class to differentiate these and work on our symptomology. And as usual, let me know if you have any questions.